All right, so today we're going to deep dive into a question I think a lot of people are curious about. How have millennials done financially over the past 5 years? Since we kind of entered this whole new world with the pandemic
Yeah.
back in March 2020. There's been so much talk about millennials and, struggling financially and being behind other generations.
Yeah, for sure.
But we've seen a ton of changes since then. The market's been crazy. We've got rising interest rates, huge inflation.
Right.
So our mission today is to really dig into the data and figure out if that narrative, of millennials falling behind is actually true.
Right.
Based on what the data actually tells us.
Absolutely.
So what we're looking at today is an article from wealthfront.com, and it's called How Millennials Have Thrived in the 5 Years Since COVID-19.
Oh, wow.
And it was published just earlier this month on March 6, 2025.
Okay. Very recent.
Super recent, yeah. And they've got some really interesting data in there, looking at trends from the third quarter of 2019 to the third quarter of 2024.
Got it.
And they're pulling from Federal Reserve data as well as some insights from their own client base.
Makes sense. Yeah. Wealthfront obviously has a lot of millennial clients, so it's good to see that they're able to provide their own unique perspective on it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what makes this article really fascinating is that it's not just, relaying dry statistics from, government sources.
Right.
It's also like, hey, let's look at what's happening with actual people,
Right. Yeah.
who are using our platform and, we have access to their data.
Yeah.
So the first thing that really jumped out at me was just the huge growth in net worth for millennials over this period. The Federal Reserve data that they cite shows that their total net worth almost quadrupled.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Quadruple.
It went from $3.94 trillion in Q3 2019 to $15.95 trillion by Q3 2024.
Wow. That's, that is remarkable. I mean, that's such a huge jump in such a short period of time.
Right. It really makes you rethink, any assumptions you might have had.
For sure.
About how this generation is doing.
Yeah. I mean, you hear a lot of doom and gloom about millennials.
Right.
Avocado toast and all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Burdened by student loans.
Can't buy houses.
Exactly. And, not being able to enter the housing market.
Right.
But these numbers tell a very different story.
Yeah, they really do.
And what's even more interesting is that Wealthfront also looked at their own millennial clients, and their data kind of mirrors this story of growth. As of January 1st, 2020, the average millennial client had $45,600 saved and invested in their Wealthfront accounts.
Okay, that's a pretty good starting point.
Yeah, not bad. And then by today, that average has grown by 137% to $108,130.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible jump.
Yeah, that's almost, that's more than double.
Yeah.
In 5 years, basically.
It is, yeah. And what's important to remember is that this is just a piece of the puzzle. The article points out that these figures don't include assets held in 401ks.
Right. Yeah.
Any equity compensation like stock options or grants,
Uh-huh.
real estate, or any other investments held outside of Wealthfront.
Right. So it could be even more.
Yeah, so the total financial picture for these millennials could be even more impressive than what these numbers suggest.
Exactly. And it would make sense, right? Because you think about millennials, especially those who started their careers. After the 2008 recession, they're becoming more established in their careers. They're starting to earn more money. They're probably getting, raises and promotions. And so it stands to reason that their overall wealth is going to be growing.
Right. And they're probably starting to, think about investing more seriously,
Yeah.
especially after seeing, some of the returns that maybe their older peers have gotten in the market.
Yeah, exactly. And, they've also probably learned from mistakes of previous generations.
Mm-hmm.
They're more likely to be saving for retirement early on, and they're more likely to be investing in things like index funds and ETFs, which have historically performed very well.
Right, exactly. And the article actually goes on to compare this growth to other generations.
Okay, interesting.
Within Wealthfront's client base.
Okay.
Over those same 5 years.
Right.
And it turns out that Gen X clients saw a 76% growth in their wealth, while baby boomers experience a 40% increase.
Okay, so still good growth, but not as much as millennials.
Right. Millennials are definitely outperforming within this specific data set.
Yeah, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what are some of the unique factors that are maybe driving this trend?
Right, exactly.
So it's not just about average growth, though.
Yeah.
The article also highlights the rising number of what they call Wealthfront millionaires.
Oh, wow. Wealthfront millionaires.
I like that. Among the millennial group, the proportion of millennial clients holding $1 million or more in their Wealthfront accounts increased by a whopping 144% over the last 5 years.
Wow, that's a huge jump.
It is, yeah.
So these are people who are really building significant wealth.
Yeah, and think about it. Millennials have had fewer years in the workforce to accumulate that kind of wealth compared to Gen X or baby boomers.
Right.
But they're seeing this rapid growth
Right.
in this higher net worth segment.
Yeah, it's impressive.
To put that into perspective, the increase in Wealthfront millionaires among Gen X was only 31% during the same period.
Okay, so much smaller.
And among baby boomers, the proportion actually decreased.
Makes sense, I guess.
Which isn't surprising, since many are entering retirement.
Yeah, they're probably starting to draw down their savings.
Exactly. So what we're seeing is significant wealth accumulation across the board for millennials in this data set, but it's especially pronounced at that higher end.
Interesting.
And that kind of leads to the next question, which is what's driving this impressive growth?
Right, what are they doing right?
Yeah, exactly. And the article points to a few key factors. The first one they call time-tested investing strategies, which sounds kind of vague, but they actually break it down into some really concrete actions.
It's okay. That's your...
So one thing they highlight is a strong commitment to consistently saving and investing the average total balance in their taxable investment accounts, which includes both Wealthfront accounts and any external accounts they've linked, grew by over 100% between March 2020 and February 2025.
Wow. So they were actively putting money in throughout the pandemic.
Exactly. They weren't just, sitting on the sidelines waiting for things to get better. They were like, you know what, I'm going to keep investing.
Smart.
Yeah. And that suggests a certain level of resilience, too, especially during those super uncertain times at the beginning of the pandemic.
Right, because the market was all over the place.
Exactly. Everyone was freaking out.
Yeah.
But the article points out that during that big market downturn in March 2020, the average monthly net deposits from millennials stayed much steadier than older generations. Yeah, it seems like they weren't panicking and selling off their investments.
Wow. So they kind of just rode the wave.
Yeah, they had that long-term perspective, which really paid off.
Right, because the market rebounded pretty quickly.
It did, yeah. And, those who stayed invested ended up benefiting from those gains.
Makes sense.
Plus, they would have been in a better position to take advantage of things like tax loss harvesting during those dips.
Yeah, that's a really good point because a lot of people don't even know about tax loss harvesting.
Right. It's a strategy where you sell investments that have lost value to offset capital gains you've made on other investments.
Right, and that can save you a lot of money on taxes.
Yeah, and millennials seem to be more savvy about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it seems like they're really paying attention to those details.
Yeah, and it's not just about timing the market either. They're also being smart about their investment approach in general.
Okay, how so?
Well, it turns out that over 90% of the invested assets held by Wealthfront's millennial clients are in globally diversified portfolios of low-cost ETFs.
ETFs.
Yeah.
Exchange-traded funds.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, those are really popular these days.
They are, yeah, and for good reason.
Yeah, they're basically baskets of stocks or bonds that trade on exchanges, just like a single stock.
Right, and they often have lower management fees compared to actively managed mutual funds.
Which can really eat into your returns.
Yeah, exactly. So millennials are essentially choosing diversification and low costs.
Which are two of the most important principles of long-term investing.
Exactly. They're not chasing the latest hot stock or trend. They're thinking about the long game.
It sounds like they're taking a really disciplined approach.
Yeah, and it seems to be working for them.
For sure.
But it wasn't just their longer-term investments that saw growth.
Okay.
Those who used Wealthfront's cash account also benefited big time.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the article mentions that those accounts consistently earn nearly 10 times the national average savings interest rate.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is, yeah. And in 2024 alone, those clients earned over $1.7 billion in interest just from their cash holdings.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, so even their short-term savings were working harder for them.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, with interest rates rising, it's more important than ever to make sure your cash is earning a decent return.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like Wealthfront's cash account is a great option for that.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Cool.
So Beyond just general investing, the article also highlights proactive retirement planning as a key driver.
Okay, that's important.
Yeah, even with all the inflation we've seen recently, millennials continued to prioritize saving for the future.
That's good to hear because a lot of people have been putting off retirement savings because of inflation.
Right. It's understandable, when your money isn't going as far.
Yeah.
But it seems like millennials are still committed to that long-term goal.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, and the numbers back it up. The average millennial Wealthfront IRA grew by over 110% since March 2020.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, and that growth is attributed to both the positive market performance we've talked about
Right.
and ongoing contributions to those retirement accounts.
So they're not just relying on market gains, they're also putting in the work.
Exactly. And to put that into perspective again,
Right.
the growth in millennial IRA balances was more than double what Gen X experienced.
Wow, so they're really outpacing older generations when it comes to retirement savings.
Yeah, it seems like they're taking it seriously.
Good for them.
So, we've talked about investments, retirement savings, but there's another big piece of the wealth building puzzle that we haven't touched on yet.
Okay, what's that?
Home ownership.
Ah, yes, the great American dream.
Exactly. And it seems like millennials have also made some serious progress in climbing the property ladder over the past 5 years.
Really? Because I feel like you hear a lot about millennials being priced out of the housing market.
Yeah, you do hear that a lot. And it's true that affordability is a huge issue.
Yeah.
But the article cites a Wall Street Journal report that shows millennials' housing wealth actually grew by $2.5 trillion between 2020 and 2024.
Wow.
And that's even after accounting for the increased mortgage debt they took on.
So it's not just about more millennials buying homes, it's about the equity they're building in those homes.
Exactly. And that trend is reflected in Wealthfront's own client data as well.
Okay, how so?
Well, the average home value for Wealthfront's millennial clients increased by over 40% between March 2020 and February 2025.
Wow, that's a huge chunk.
It is, yeah. And once again, this growth outpaced that of older generations.
Okay.
Gen X saw a 33% increase and baby boomers a 29% increase in their average home values.
Interesting. So even in the housing market, millennials are coming out ahead.
It seems like it.
Makes you wonder what's driving that difference.
Right. Is it just that they're buying in different markets?
Totally.
Or are they making different choices about the types of homes they're buying?
Yeah, maybe they're more willing to buy fixer-uppers.
Yeah, or maybe they're more comfortable with a longer commute.
Right.
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely an interesting trend.
Yeah, for sure.
So when you look across investments, retirement savings, and even home ownership, the data presented in this article really does paint a pretty clear picture of significant financial progress for millennials.
Yeah, it really challenges that whole narrative of them falling behind.
It does, yeah. And the article even touches on Wealthfront's own perspective,
Okay.
highlighting their long-standing belief in millennials and their efforts to create products that support this generation's financial goals.
Yeah, they've always been really focused on serving millennials.
They have, yeah. And they conclude that millennials have shown remarkable resilience
Makes sense.
and are actually on track to be one of the wealthiest generations, even surpassing previous generations at the same age in terms of wealth accumulation.
That's a bold statement.
It is, yeah, but the data seems to back it up.
Yeah, I guess so.
Of course, they do acknowledge that the current macroeconomic environment is still full of challenges and uncertainties.
Yeah, right. Inflation is still high.
Exactly, and the market could take another downturn.
Yeah, who knows what the future holds.
Right, but they emphasize that the resilience and long-term approach that millennials have shown over the past 5 years are really crucial for continued financial success.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about staying the course.
Exactly.
Right.
Don't panic.
Right.
Stick to your plan and ride out the ups and downs.
Yeah, and keep investing consistently.
Exactly.
It's just like a good recipe for success.
It does, yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Wealthfront article, the key takeaway seems to be that despite those common perceptions of millennials struggling financially, the data actually suggests something very different.
Yeah, it's almost a complete 180 from what you usually hear.
It is, yeah, and it's a really encouraging sign, not just for millennials themselves,
Right.
but for the economy as a whole.
Yeah, because millennials are a huge generation.
They are, yeah, and their financial health is going to have a big impact on the country's economic future.
Absolutely. So it's good to know that they're doing well.
It is, yeah. It gives me some hope for the future.
Me.
So considering these findings, what assumptions might you have held about generational wealth accumulation, and how does this information challenge or confirm those assumptions?
Right. It's a good question to think about.
Yeah, and what other factors beyond those mentioned today might play a role in shaping the financial futures of different generations in the coming years.
Yeah, that's something to ponder.
Definitely, and it's something that we'll continue to explore here on the Deep Dive.
All
So
right.
thanks for joining us,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.
See ya.